Clifton Ashford smiled the way men smile when they have already decided how the conversation ends. He held the document out with 2 fingers, the way you'd hand someone a parking ticket. Routine, inevitable, done. Naomi Ashford-Briggs looked at the paper. Then she looked at him. She did not take it. 12 hours earlier, Naomi had been doing what she did most mornings before the city woke up, working. A paralegal certification she was finishing on her own time, after a full shift, because she believed that understanding the law was the closest thing to armor a person could carry. She had coffee going, she had her notes, she had a plan for the day. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go. The voice on the other end was thin, careful, the kind of careful that isn't confusion, it's control. The kind a person uses when they know someone else might be listening. Naomi? She knew that voice before the second syllable. Ruthanne Ashford-Briggs, her grandmother. The woman who had raised her after her mother left and her father worked 2 jobs that still weren't enough. The woman with the iron-clear voice and the sharp eyes, and the hands that could still braid hair and roll pie crust and sign a legal document without a single tremor of uncertainty. That voice was now barely above a whisper. I'm at a place called Sycamore Ridge. I did not choose to come here. Then a pause. Naomi could hear something in the background. A PA system maybe, or a door. And then, so quietly she almost missed it. Blue folder. The line went dead. Naomi stood there for 4 seconds. She counted them later, the way you count things you want to understand. She told herself it was the medication, that Ruthanne had been recovering from a hip procedure and the anesthesia could linger, could make a sharp mind temporarily soft at the edges. She told herself blue folder was the kind of fragment a sedated mind produces, a dream word, a half sentence. She almost believed it. Then she picked up her keys. Sycamore Ridge sat on the edge of a suburb Naomi had driven through 100 times without ever stopping. It looked like every other care facility. The careful landscaping, the automatic doors, the smell of industrial cleaner, and something floral trying to cover it. The kind of place that works very hard to look like a choice. Naomi walked through the automatic doors and stopped. Clifton and Eveline were already there. That was the first wrong thing. Not the facility, not the call. The fact that they were already there, positioned in the lobby like they had been waiting, like they had known she was coming. Clifton opened his arms. Naomi, we're so relieved you came. Eveline touched her own collarbone in that way she had, the gesture that was always performing something. It was a scary episode. We didn't want to alarm you until we knew she was stable. Naomi looked at them both. She kept her voice level. Nobody called me. Clifton's smile didn't move. Everything happened so fast. You know how these things go. He produced the document then, unfolded it with one hand, held it out like it settled something. Power of attorney. Clifton R. Ashford, named agent. Ruthanne Ashford-Briggs, principal, signed and notarized. She signed everything herself, he said, and then, as if it were nothing, as if it were just a footnote, just like she signed everything else last spring. Naomi looked at the paper. She looked at the date. She filed the sentence away without knowing yet what she was filing it for. I want to see her, she said. They gave her 8 minutes. She knew it was 8 because she watched the administrator check the time twice. Ruthanne's room was small, a single window with a view of the parking lot, a nightstand with a photo turned face down, a closet with the door slightly open. The room had been arranged to look lived in and felt like no one had been consulted about how. Ruthanne looked up when Naomi came in, not the way someone looks up when they are confused or sedated or frightened, the way someone looks up when they have been waiting. She reached out and took Naomi's wrist. Her grip was stronger than it had any right to be, the grip of someone who had decided that this moment mattered and was not going to let it pass without being certain it was received. She pulled Naomi close, and she said, barely a breath, "He did it while I was sleeping." Before Naomi could answer, the door opened. The facility administrator, and behind her, filling the frame with his pressed shirt and easy authority, Clifton. "She's been a little agitated today," he said, his voice warm with concern that didn't reach his eyes. "We don't want to overexcite her." He touched Naomi's shoulder, light, steering. "Going forward, visits need to be scheduled in writing. Through me, doctor's recommendation." Ruthanne released Naomi's wrist. She said nothing. She did not argue. She did not reach for her again. She simply watched. As Clifton steered Naomi toward the exit with one hand on her shoulder, she glanced back and saw Ruthanne watching her from the doorway of her room. Not confused, not medicated blank, but precise and waiting, like a woman who has planned for exactly this moment. If you believe the truth always finds a way to the surface, this is the kind of story told right here. Subscribe because every chapter of this one is going to matter. Naomi did not sleep that night. Not really. She lay on top of her comforter in her blazer and stared at the ceiling and replayed the way Ruthanne had looked at her from that doorway. Not frightened, not lost, not the way the brochures always showed elderly women in care facilities, soft and confused and grateful for the attention. Precise. That was the only word that kept surfacing. Ruthanne had looked at her the way she used to look at a contract before she signed it, reading every clause twice. By 5 in the morning, she had a plan. It wasn't a good plan. It was thin and improvised and depended on a facility administrator who hadn't arrived for his shift yet, but it was the only plan she had. She drove back to Sycamore Ridge at 7:45, carrying a canvas tote bag and a story about a forgotten phone charger. The man at the desk was not the administrator. He was young, maybe 26, with tired eyes and a lanyard that read Prentice in block letters. He looked at her tote bag, then at her face, then at the empty corridor behind him. He said the administrator came in at 8:15. He said visiting hours were at 10. Then he said quietly that he was going to check on a resident in the East Wing and that the hall to room 18 would be unattended for approximately 10 minutes. He didn't look at her when he said it. She found room 18 and let herself in. Ruthanne was sitting up in the bed. Not propped, sitting, back straight, hands folded in her lap, silver locks pinned back from her face. She was wearing the housecoat they'd put her in, but her posture inside it said plainly that she had not accepted it. She looked at Naomi the way you look at someone you have been waiting for and are relieved to see arrive before it got any later. They did not embrace. There wasn't time, and Ruthanne seemed to understand that. She reached out and took Naomi's wrist in both hands. The grip steadier than Naomi had expected, steadier than it had been yesterday, and she held it for a moment without speaking. That was when Naomi noticed the nightstand. There was a framed photograph lying face down on the surface. Not fallen. The nightstand was flat and the frame was too light to topple on its own. Someone had placed it that way. Naomi reached out and turned it over. It was the two of them. A candid shot, the kind taken without ceremony. Naomi in a blazer she recognized from 3 years ago. Ruthanne in her good wool coat. Both of them standing beside a desk in an office with a notary seal visible on the wall behind them. Someone had caught them mid-conversation. Ruthanne with one hand raised as if making a point, Naomi leaning slightly in to listen. They were both smiling. Not performing, actually smiling, the way you do when you are doing something important and you know it. Naomi looked at Ruthanne. Ruthanne looked back at her and said nothing, but her eyes moved, just once, just briefly, to the closet on the far wall. A single unhurried glance, the kind you make when you are pointing at something without using your hands because you know someone is watching and you do not want them to see you point. Then she squeezed Naomi's wrist and let go. Naomi opened her mouth to ask. The question was already forming. What's in the closet, Grandma? What did you put in there? When the door opened behind her. Eveline stood in the doorway. Champagne blonde bob, linen blazer, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She took in the scene with the particular efficiency of someone who had been expecting to find exactly this. Naomi at the nightstand, the photograph in her hands, Ruthanne watching. "You're not supposed to be here until 10, Eveline said. Her voice was the low, patient register she always used, the tone of someone who has decided in advance that you are being unreasonable and is simply waiting for you to finish. Naomi set the photograph back on the nightstand, face up this time. She said she had forgotten a charger. She said she was just leaving. Eveline walked her out personally, which told Naomi everything she needed to know about how closely Clifton had briefed her. They moved in silence through the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the small lounge where a television was on with the sound low. At the main door, Eveline said, with the warmth of someone closing a meeting, that it might be best if Naomi called ahead next time, that Ruthanne's routine was important, that disruptions could be hard on her. Naomi said she understood. It was Prentice who passed her at the door. He was carrying a clipboard and looking at it. He did not slow down. He did not look at her, but his arm brushed hers as he went by, and when she stepped through the door into the cold morning air, she felt something in her palm, folded small, the way you fold a napkin at a dinner table when you don't want anyone to notice. She waited until she reached her car. She unfolded it in her lap. A room number written in careful block letters, 14B, and below it 4 words, "She remembers everything." Naomi sat with that for a long moment. She looked up at the facility's beige facade, the clean windows, the modest sign, the ordinary parking lot. The kind of place that is designed to look unremarkable so that everything that happens inside it stays inside it. And then something shifted in the way she was seeing it. Her grandmother had not called her in the middle of the night because she was frightened and confused and reaching for a familiar voice. She had called her because she had a plan. She had chosen her words carefully. Blue folder, 2 words in the seconds before the line went dead. And she had planted a photograph face down on a nightstand where she knew Naomi would find it, and she had pointed with her eyes because her hands were being watched. She had been communicating in the only language she'd been left. Naomi sits in her car in the parking lot and unfolds the napkin again, then looks up at the facility's beige facade and realizes. Her grandmother didn't call her in a moment of confusion. She called her because she had a plan, and Naomi is already inside it. The plan was already in motion. Naomi just hadn't known she was part of it yet. She didn't go home that night. She drove instead to Ruthanne's house, the small brick 2-story on Callaway Street that had smelled like cedar and coffee for as long as Naomi could remember. The front door was unlocked. That should have been the first warning. 3 boxes sat in the kitchen, 2 more in the hallway. Clifton's work. She recognized the efficiency of it, the same smooth confidence he'd carried through every conversation at Sycamore Ridge. No probate filing, no court order, no authority she could locate in any document he had ever shown her. Just boxes, and the assumption that no one would think to ask. Naomi moved through the rooms the way Ruthanne had taught her to move through anything unfamiliar, slowly and with her eyes open. The cookbook was still there. The Joy of Cooking, 1975 edition, its spine held together by a rubber band Ruthanne had wound around it sometime in the early 90s. Naomi pulled it from the shelf because Clifton hadn't gotten to the books yet, and because something made her check the back. The card was tucked into the inside back cover, flat and deliberate, the way you tuck something you intend to find later. Teodora Voss-Kamara, Elder Law and Estate Litigation. Naomi stood in her grandmother's kitchen, in the middle of a house being quietly stolen, and read the name twice. Teodora Voss-Kamara did not seem surprised to get the call. She listened without interrupting while Naomi explained. The phone call, the facility, Clifton's power of attorney, the napkin, the boxes in Ruthanne's kitchen. When Naomi finished, Teodora asked only one question. Was Naomi in possession of any documents with Ruthanne's signature from the past 12 months? Naomi said no. Teodora said, "Good, come in tomorrow morning. And don't touch anything else in that house tonight." By 10 the following morning, Teodora had already submitted a records request to Sycamore Ridge under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Ruthanne's rights as a patient, not Clifton's rights as a self-appointed guardian. The facility's compliance office, apparently unaware that Clifton's attorney hadn't yet filed a blocking motion, sent the intake file by secure upload before noon. Teodora read through it methodically. Then she stopped. She set the page down and slid it across the table to Naomi without a word. It was a nursing note, 1 paragraph, buried 4 pages into the admissions file between a fall risk assessment and a dietary preference form. The nurse who wrote it, her credentials listed at the bottom as a licensed practical nurse, intake rotation, had documented that the incoming patient, Ruthanne Ashford-Briggs, was post-operative day 2 following a right hip replacement, currently on a fentanyl-based pain management protocol and responsive only to direct physical stimulation at time of admission. The timestamp on the note? 2:47 p.m. The timestamp on Clifton's power of attorney, the document he had waved in the lobby like a hall pass, the document he had cited when he said she signed everything herself, just like she signed everything else last spring, was 3:15 p.m., the same afternoon. 38 minutes later, Ruthanne had been under surgical anesthesia sedation, and Clifton had known. She agreed to this. This is what she wanted. every patient, reasonable, slightly sorry for Naomi tone he had used in that lobby. It had all been constructed on top of a signature that Ruthanne could not have given, from a woman who could not have consented, on a document a nurse had quietly noted and then filed where no one was supposed to look. The note had not been redacted. It had simply been placed where it would not be found unless someone was specifically looking for it. Someone had been hoping no one would look. Teodora made 3 calls in the next hour. The first was to Sycamore Ridge's compliance officer, requesting the name and current employment status of the LPN who wrote the intake note. The second was to the county clerk's office, confirming that no probate guardianship petition had yet been formally served on Naomi, which meant Clifton had filed but not yet completed service, which meant the window was still open. The third call Naomi didn't hear. Teodora stepped into the hallway for that one, and when she came back, she sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at Naomi steadily. "There is something else you should know," she said, "about the closet." She didn't say more than that yet. She didn't need to. The way she said it, the same unhurried register she used for everything, which made ordinary sentences feel like testimony, told Naomi that whatever was in that closet was not incidental. Naomi filed it in the part of her mind where she was keeping everything Ruthanne had pointed her toward: the photograph, the napkin, the cookbook, the card. Her grandmother had not been leaving clues for someone to stumble over. She had been laying a path for someone specific to follow. That evening, Naomi's phone rang from a number she didn't recognize, a law office in the financial district. The attorney on the line identified himself as representing Clifton Ashford and read her a cease and desist letter in a flat professional voice. The letter warned her against interfering with lawful guardianship proceedings currently before the probate court, threatened an emergency restraining order if she returned to Sycamore Ridge without Clifton's written authorization, and characterized her visits to Ruthanne's house as potential interference with estate assets under active legal protection. She wrote down every word. She had learned that from Ruthanne. When someone talks, you listen for what they're telling you they're afraid of. She called Teodora the moment the line went dead. Teodora read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table between them. She had asked Naomi to come, even at that hour, and tapped the case number printed in the upper right corner of the document. Probate Court, County of Record, case number stamped in clean black type. Clifton's own attorney had put it in writing. Teodora looked up. "He made a mistake putting this in writing, and we are going to use every word of it." Teodora did not wait for morning. By 9 that same evening, she had drafted the emergency motion, cross-referenced the fraudulent filing number from Clifton's own cease and desist letter, and attached the buried nursing note, the one documenting that Ruthanne had been under post-surgical sedation at the precise hour she allegedly signed the admission consent forms. The motion asked the probate court to halt all guardianship proceedings pending a fraud review. It named dates, signatures, and a case number that Clifton's own attorney had handed them, gift-wrapped in legal letterhead. Naomi listened to Teodora read the motion aloud over the phone and said almost nothing. She had moved past the stage where any of this surprised her. What she felt now was not grief and not panic. It was the particular cold focus that arrives when a person realizes the only way through is straight. The court granted the emergency motion at a hearing Clifton could not attend without his own attorney present, and his attorney, it turned out, was unavailable before 10 the following morning. By the time Clifton knew what had been filed, a court-appointed visitor had already been assigned to accompany Naomi to Sycamore Ridge for a supervised visit that he had no legal mechanism to block. He was there when they arrived. Of course he was. He stood in the corridor outside Ruthanne's room with his arms folded and his jaw forward, and he watched Naomi and the court-appointed visitor, a compact woman with a clipboard and a county lanyard, walk past him without pausing. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would not be written down. Ruthanne looked up when Naomi entered. She did not look relieved. She looked like someone who had been holding a position under pressure for a very long time and had finally heard the sound they were listening for. Her hands, the ones that shook now from the early Parkinson's, were folded deliberately still in her lap. Her eyes moved to Naomi's face, then to the county lanyard, then back to Naomi's face, and she gave a single, small nod. Naomi crossed the room and went directly to the closet. She remembered the moment from the second visit with perfect clarity now. Ruthanne's eyes, careful and deliberate, moving from the nightstand photo, the two of them at a notary's office, Naomi and Ruthanne, Ruthanne's hand on the table beside a document, to the closet door. Not confusion, not the wandering gaze of a woman medicated into compliance. A direction, a set of coordinates, and before that, the phone call. 2 words before the line cut. Blue folder. Naomi had told herself it was the sedation talking. She had written it off as the static of a frightened old woman reaching for language that wasn't quite there. She had been wrong about that. She understood that now, kneeling on the thin carpet of a care facility closet, pressing her fingers along the seam where the cloth lining met the interior wall. She found it at the back left corner. The stitching was tight and even. Ruthanne had always been precise with her hands. But the seam gave when Naomi pressed it, and the cloth folded back to reveal a slim blue folder. The kind sold at any office supply store, tucked flat against the interior panel. Naomi pulled it free. The court-appointed visitor stepped forward immediately and said, "I need to document this." Her voice was professional and even. She photographed the closet, the seam, the position of the folder before Naomi had fully opened it. She wrote the time in her notes. She was thorough in the way that mattered, the kind of thorough that holds up in a courtroom. Inside the folder was a durable power of attorney. Naomi's name appeared on the first line as sole agent. The document was dated 8 months before the version Clifton had been waving like a hall pass since the first day at Sycamore Ridge. The notary seal at the bottom belonged to Teodora Voss-Kamara. Naomi read it twice. Then she looked at the notary seal again. The same name, the same woman who had handed her a business card tucked into the back of a cookbook. Ruthanne had not found Teodora by accident. Ruthanne had chosen her. Months ago, before any of this began, before Clifton had made his move, before the care facility, before the sedated signature on a consent form that was never lawfully given. She had been building this for weeks, quietly, methodically, in the space between what Clifton was watching and what he thought he understood. From the hallway, Clifton watched. He said nothing. His attorney wasn't there. There was no one to whisper to, no administrator to summon. No procedural lever left to pull. He watched the court-appointed visitor photograph the blue folder and write in her notes, and the gold signet ring on his right hand caught the fluorescent light as his fingers began, very slightly, to shake. He had spent months calculating what Ruthanne could and could not do from inside that room. He had measured her by the tremor in her hands and the thin sound of her voice on a bad morning. He had mistaken stillness for surrender and patience for confusion, and it had cost him everything he thought he had secured. Ruthanne had not moved from her chair. She watched the court visitor work. She watched Naomi hold the folder. And then she looked at Naomi, over the visitor's shoulder, across the small room that had been built to contain her, and she spoke in a voice that did not waver, that carried none of the thin, careful whisper from the first phone call, that was exactly as iron-clear as it had always been when no one was managing her. "I told you I wasn't confused." And for the first time since the phone call, since the lobby, since the cease and desist letter, since every door that had been closed in her face with a smile, Naomi let herself cry. The tears didn't last long. Naomi wasn't built for long crying. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, straightened her blazer, and stood in the hallway for exactly 30 seconds before she remembered where she still needed to go. Room 14B. Prentice had pressed that napkin into her palm 3 days ago. A room number and 5 words. She remembers everything. At the time, Naomi had filed it away behind everything else that was on fire. Now, with the court visitor still completing paperwork down the hall and Clifton nowhere visible, she had a window. She took it. The woman who opened the door was small, unhurried, and entirely unsurprised. She had the look of someone who had been waiting, not with impatience, but with the particular patience of a person who has already done everything they can do and now simply needs one more person to arrive. Her name was Hestia O'Byrne Cole. She had worked the county probate filing window for 19 years before her hip replacement brought her here. She offered Naomi the chair by the window and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap. She didn't need to be told who Naomi was. She had recognized Clifton the moment he stepped up to her window, not from family resemblance, but from the filing itself. She had processed thousands of guardianship petitions. She knew what a notary stamp looked like, knew the registered seals for every notary in the county by sight, the way a musician knows a wrong note. The stamp on Clifton's power of attorney didn't belong to anyone registered in the county. She had checked, twice. She had written it all down that same evening. Every detail. Dated it, signed it, sealed it in that envelope. And then she had waited. "I didn't know who would come," Hestia said. "I only knew someone would." Naomi thought about Prentice, moving through that corridor without breaking stride, a napkin in his palm and a room number in his head. A quiet act by a quiet man in a building where the wrong people held all the official noise. She understood now what he had done. He hadn't been able to do anything else, and so he had done the one thing he could. She took the envelope with both hands. The emergency probate hearing was not a dramatic event. That was the thing about the truth arriving in this particular form. It didn't need theater. It needed only to be laid out, piece by piece, in the correct order. Teodora Voss-Kamara was very good at order. She presented the earlier power of attorney first, Ruthanne's own document dated 8 months before Clifton's version, notarized by Teodora herself, naming Naomi Ashford-Briggs as sole agent. Then the buried nursing intake note, the one that recorded Ruthanne as still under post-surgical sedation at the precise hour she had allegedly signed Clifton's consent forms. Then Hestia's sworn statement, 19 years of professional expertise distilled into 4 handwritten pages. And finally, the fraudulent filing itself, pulled from the county's own records using the case number Clifton's attorney had printed at the top of that cease and desist letter. The letter Clifton had sent to frighten Naomi into silence. The judge read. She asked 3 questions. Teodora answered each one in a single sentence. The guardianship petition was voided. The matter was referred to the county district attorney's office. Elder financial exploitation, probate fraud, coercion of a vulnerable adult. Naomi was granted immediate authority as Ruthanne's lawful agent effective that afternoon. Clifton said nothing. His signet ring hand lay flat on the table, and he did not move it. They discharged her the same afternoon. She had refused the facility's offered wheelchair. She walked out of room 7 under her own authority in her own clothes, not the faded housecoat they had put her in on the first day, as if softening her edges might soften her mind. She had known what that housecoat was. She had worn it anyway, and she had planned, and she had waited. Naomi walked beside her. At the lobby doors, Ruthanne stopped. She turned, not because she had forgotten something, not because she was confused. She turned with the deliberateness of a woman who has decided that a thing needs to be said and intends to say it once, clearly, and never again. Clifton was standing near the reception desk, Eveline a half-step behind him, champagne blonde bob immaculate, her face arranged into an expression she probably believed looked composed. Clifton looked like a man standing in the wreckage of something he had spent months constructing, trying to remember what it had looked like before he built it. Ruthanne looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was exactly as iron-clear as it had always been. "I raised you better than this, Clifton." She didn't wait for an answer. There wasn't one worth hearing. She turned back to the doors, took Naomi's arm, and walked into the light. 3 weeks later, Naomi sat across from Teodora reviewing the DA's charging documents. Elder financial exploitation, probate fraud, coercion of a vulnerable adult. The language was precise and cold and correct in the way that legal language is when it finally catches up to something that should have been stopped much sooner. Naomi's phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up. A text from Ruthanne. A single photograph. Ruthanne in her own kitchen, morning light through her own window, holding her own mug, silver locks loose around her shoulders. The caption read, "Home. Don't be late for Sunday dinner." That was the thing about Ruthanne Ashford-Briggs. She had never been confused. She had never been lost. She had been a woman in an impossible situation who understood, with absolute clarity, exactly what she needed and exactly who she trusted to come. She had sewn the map into the closet lining. She had made the call. She had whispered "blue folder" through a phone that might have been monitored, and she had waited with the patience of someone who had already done the hard work and needed only for the right person to arrive. The right person had arrived, and every thread Ruthanne left, the photo turned face down, the eyes that moved to the closet, the 2 words on a cutting phone call, every one of them had held. Justice, when it finally comes, rarely arrives as an explosion. It arrives the way Ruthanne walked out of that lobby, steady, unhurried, in her own clothes, on her own terms. It arrives in the accumulated weight of every quiet person who did the one thing they could. A nurse who pressed a napkin into a palm, a former clerk who sealed an envelope and waited, an attorney who knew that a case number printed on a threat letter was the key to dismantling the threat itself. It arrives because someone planted the truth early enough that it had time to grow roots. Ruthanne had known that. She had known it all along. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever watched someone fight to be believed and wondered whether the truth would surface in time, drop a word in the comments. Tell us who in your life has that kind of quiet strength. And if you know someone who needs to hear that the truth has a way of holding on, send this to them. That's exactly who this was made for. The people who stay until the end of a story like this are the ones who still believe justice is possible. That's the right instinct. Stay here. There's more on the end screen.